The badge was still warm from the laminator. Rachel Torres held it between her thumb and forefinger, the plastic flexible enough to bend, the temporary designation printed in red across the bottom corner. 1 month. That's what the contract said. 1 month of contract work at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, filling gaps in the nursing roster, asking no questions, drawing no attention. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the particular staleness of a building that recycled the same air through the same vents for 40 years. She stood at the staff entrance at 6:41 a.m., 7 minutes before her shift began, studying the directory mounted beside the security checkpoint. Emergency Department, Level 2. Trauma Wing, East Corridor. She'd done this before, 5 hospitals in 3 years, each one identical in the ways that mattered. Fluorescent lights. Linoleum tiles marked by cartwheels and blood that never quite cleaned out of the grout. Hallways that moved like arteries, pulsing with crisis and recovery and the steady hum of machines that kept people breathing. A woman in a teal scrubs jacket pushed past her without apology, coffee cup held like a weapon, eyes fixed on something in the distance that only she could see. Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday morning at 6:48 a.m. The shift change hadn't begun. The chaos was still building. Dr. Jonathan Sterling saw her from across the lobby the moment she approached the security turnstile with her new badge held out like a question. Silver hair, expensively cut. Posture like a man who'd never been asked to leave a room. The kind of doctor whose opinions had weight because he'd never allowed them to be questioned. He watched her from the coffee station, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth, processing the sight of someone he didn't recognize in scrubs that didn't quite fit right, hair pulled back tight enough to change the shape of her face, eyes that moved through the lobby like she was conducting inventory. She didn't fit. That was the conclusion Sterling reached in the 3 seconds he observed her. Not the confidence of someone who belonged here. Not the easy familiarity of the nurses who'd worked this emergency department for years, moving through the corridors like they owned the tiles. This was a temp. He could smell it on her, that particular scent of someone working borrowed time, waiting for the permanent staff to assess whether she was worth keeping around. Rachel moved through the turnstile, her badge triggering the magnetic lock with a click that sounded like a handgun safety releasing. The sound registered, and she paused for less than a fraction of a second, just long enough for the professional part of her brain to recognize it as a sound she hadn't heard in 3 years, the kind of sound that created muscle memory in places she'd been ordered to forget. She continued walking. The emergency department stretched across the entire east wing, all glass partitions and rolling crash carts and the particular smell of human injury being treated with precision. The charge nurse at the central station was on her phone, gesturing at a whiteboard that listed 17 bed assignments in blue dry erase marker. Rachel approached quietly and waited for permission to exist. "You're the temp." The charge nurse, her name tag read Diane Chen, 23 years pinned to her scrub pocket, didn't look up. "Rachel Torres. Starting today." "Okay. You're on trauma rotation, Bay 3 and 4. Dr. Sterling's running point this morning." "He's..." Diane paused, searching for the diplomatic phrase. "Direct. You'll get used to it. Handoff report happens at 7. Follow the RN assigned to your bay, don't make decisions without asking, and for God's sake, don't correct anyone in front of their residents unless the patient's actually dying." The last instruction landed like a warning wrapped in procedure. Rachel nodded and made a mental note. This hospital had a hierarchy problem. Worse than most. The kind of environment where ego protected incompetence because questioning ego meant professional isolation. She'd worked environments like this before. The key was remaining invisible until invisibility was no longer possible. She found the employee lockers in a back corridor off the medication storage room. Locker 247. The combination was written on her paperwork, 0-28-14, and it opened with a smooth mechanical tumble. The locker was small, barely large enough for a shift's worth of belongings. She placed her personal phone on the upper shelf, powered off, and then reached into her gym bag for the object she'd kept wrapped in 2 layers of plastic for 3 years. Combat boots. Size 9. The name tape on the heel still legible if you knew how to look, Torres, M. Her hands, steady through most situations, developed a micro-tremor as she positioned the boots in the back corner of the locker, wrapped in plastic, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them specifically. The tremor lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she breathed in through her nose, chlorine and rubber and the faint copper taste of adrenaline in the back of her throat, and closed her eyes. Her son had worn boots like these. Had walked through San Jin with them on, through dust and blood and the particular calculus of decisions that got people killed or got them home. Her son, who'd been gone for 3 years and 4 months, whose commanding officer was somewhere in this hospital, probably waiting for a CT result or an X-ray, still mute from shrapnel that had shattered his vocal cords in the same valley that had taken everything from Rachel but the ability to save other people. She locked the locker and stood for 10 seconds without moving. The tremor subsided. The breathing normalized. The part of her that had survived classified operations in places that no longer existed on official maps reasserted itself with the kind of discipline that came from training so deep it lived in the marrow. She was a temporary nurse at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was invisible. That was the mission. That was the only way this worked. The emergency department came alive at 6:58 a.m., the moment the night shift began handing off their critical patients to the day team. Rachel positioned herself at the edge of the trauma bay, observing the choreography of crisis management with the kind of focused attention that made her nearly invisible to everyone around her. 2 residents were stationed around a patient in Bay 2, a 64-year-old male with acute myocardial infarction, EKG tracing still scrolling across the monitor in the distinctive pattern of electrical chaos. Dr. Sterling entered the bay at 7:04 a.m., his white coat pristine, a tablet tucked under his arm like a general carrying battle plans. The resident straightened. The atmosphere shifted, the air pressure in the room actually changed, the way it does when a predator enters a space occupied by prey that knows it's been assessed. Cardiac catheterization consult has been placed, one of the residents reported. Waiting on interventional cardiology to stage the procedure. Sterling nodded, barely acknowledging the information, and then began reviewing the medications. His finger stopped on the dopamine drip, and Rachel watched his eyes narrow as he performed the calculation, mentally running through the patient's weight, the cardiac output requirement, the milliliters per kilogram per minute that would push adequate perfusion without overshooting into dangerous tachycardia. Increase the dopamine to 8 micrograms per kilogram per minute, he said. Patients crashing into cardiogenic shock. We need more aggressive support. One of the residents reached for the pump to adjust the infusion rate. Rachel, positioned behind the monitor and ostensibly documenting vitals, noticed the calculation was off, not dramatically, not by enough to kill the patient, but by enough to potentially induce arrhythmia if combined with the other pressors Sterling had ordered. The math was simple, to 90-kilo patient at 8 micrograms per kilogram per minute was 720 micrograms per minute. Sterling had calculated 680. It was a small error. But errors in emergency medicine, even small ones, had consequences that rippled through hours and sometimes years. She waited until the residents had left the bay, until Sterling was reviewing the next patient's imaging on his tablet, until the moment of professional exposure had passed into relative safety. Then she approached him quietly, aware of the power dynamics in the space, the attending physician at the center of authority, the temporary nurse at the absolute periphery. Dr. Sterling, I noticed a discrepancy in the dopamine calculation. She kept her voice low, kept her posture deferential. For a 90-kilo patient, 8 micrograms per kilogram per minute would be 720 micrograms per minute, not 680. I wanted to confirm that was the intended dose before the resident adjusted the pump. She watched his face process this information, watched the micro-expression that flashed across his features as he realized 3 things simultaneously. 1, she was correct. 2, she'd corrected him in private. And 3, she knew enough about pharmacology to understand the implications. The calculation error resolved into something else, a challenge to the hierarchy. Sterling's jaw clenched. Thank you for pointing that out, he said, his voice moving down an octave in that particular way that men used when they were deciding whether to accept correction or destroy the person offering it. I'll adjust the protocol. But his eyes had changed. Rachel saw it happen, the moment when a temporary nurse transformed from invisible to a threat. She returned to the monitor station, pulled up the next patient's chart, and felt the weight of his attention settle on the back of her shoulders like a physical thing. The chart loaded. She scrolled through the vitals, through the imaging results, through the medication administration log, and then froze. Captain James Morrison. Room 212. Admitted at 11:33 p.m. the previous evening with blunt force trauma to the abdomen and thoracic cavity. Status: conscious, stable, nonverbal. Purple Heart recipient, 2 tours, classified service record. Age 41. The last address on file was a VA facility in San Diego, but the emergency contact field contained no information. The last address on Captain Morrison's discharge summary from Walter Reed, the one Rachel had memorized 3 years ago, was that same facility in San Diego. Her hands, steady enough to place 4 lines in moving helicopters, steady enough to perform field trauma assessment under fire, steady enough to lock away every shred of evidence that she was anything more than a temporary nurse, began the micro-tremor again. This time it lasted longer. This time she had to set down the tablet and wait for her breathing to normalize. Somewhere in this hospital, in room 212, was the man who'd commanded her son in Sanjin. The man whose voice she'd last heard on a classified video call from a military hospital, informing her that Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Torres would not be coming home. The man whose last official correspondence to her had been a typed letter on Pentagon letterhead, the kind of letter that meant everything was classified and nothing could be discussed and his name would disappear from every official record and she was to consider her service erased. She had 42 minutes before the shift rotation would require her to assess a patient in room 212. 42 minutes to compartmentalize the fact that Captain Morrison was lying somewhere in this hospital, probably in pain, probably traumatized, probably unaware that the person who'd served under him was working as a temporary nurse in the emergency department that was treating his injuries. The tremor stopped. Rachel pulled up the next patient's chart and continued her work with the kind of focus that came from understanding that some things were larger than emotion, older than grief, and more important than the fact that she was one chance encounter away from having her entire cover collapse into the truth. The stack of patient charts felt heavier than it should have as Rachel continued her afternoon rounds, each name a small commitment, each notation a reminder that she was here to do a job nobody else could see her doing. The charts were her anchor, her purpose, her reason to exist in a place where she didn't belong. Or at least that's what Dr. Sterling had already decided. By 12:06 p.m., his decision had become institutional fact. Rachel was at the nurse's station sorting medication refills when she heard his voice rise above the ambient hum of beeping monitors and ringing phones. Dr. Sterling stood near the trauma board, flanked by 2 residents and 3 nurses who suddenly found their computers very interesting. His posture was relaxed, confident, the kind of ease that came from 20 years of being the most important person in every room he entered. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'll give her 3 days," he announced, not bothering to lower his volume. "These agency temps always fold when they realize we run an actual emergency department here. Not some walk-in clinic. A real ER." He paused, letting his audience absorb the distinction. "Any takers on that bet?" "I'm saying she quits by Friday." "Sweetheart's not built for this." Rachel's hands didn't stop moving. She continued filing charts with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent years compartmentalizing, separating the voice in the room from the oxygen in her lungs. But she felt his gaze flick toward her, felt the weight of his expectation that she would react, that she would flinch, or blush, or break eye contact first. She didn't. She kept her eyes on the chart in front of her, her jaw set, and took one measured breath through her nose. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye, unbidden, unwelcome, and she wiped it away with her thumb without breaking visual contact with the papers she was sorting. One of the nurses laughed nervously. The others found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. The nickname started exactly 1 hour later during a code response. The overhead system crackled, code blue, room for 07, patient condition deteriorating, all available personnel respond, and Rachel moved with a kind of fluid efficiency that came from muscle memory older than her civilian identity. By the time she reached the room, Dr. Sterling was already there, already in command, already expecting the world to arrange itself according to his instructions. "Get me the intubation kit," he barked, not to anyone in particular, just into the general gravity of his own authority. "And someone call respiratory. We need actual help here, not temp hesitation." Rachel was already moving. She had the equipment assembled before the resident even understood what was being asked. Laryngoscope, blade, tubes in ascending sizes, stylet, tape, suction ready. She placed each item in Sterling's pathway like a chess piece, moving itself into position for the master player's convenience. He waved her away without acknowledgement. "Good. Now clear the family from the hallway." She did. And returned. And waited for the next command that wouldn't come, because she had already anticipated every requirement he might voice. This was a language she spoke fluently, the grammar of crisis, the syntax of saving lives when everything was breaking at once. Her hands knew this. Her body remembered. The code lasted 7 minutes. The patient stabilized. Sterling took credit in a voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all mechanical confidence and residual power. Rachel restocked the equipment without being asked. At 1:03 p.m., she carried her lunch tray toward a small table near the emergency department in trance, her hand steady, her breathing regulated, her face composed into the neutral expression of someone who had learned long ago that visibility was a vulnerability. The cafeteria smelled like institutional meat and overboiled vegetables, and something underneath it all, the faint chemical signature of bleach cutting through organic decay. She navigated the crowd with practiced invisibility. Dr. Sterling sat near the center of the cafeteria with 2 attending physicians and a department chair, his voice carrying the confident amplitude of someone used to being heard. He wore a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars. His smile was the smile of a man who had never once had to consider the possibility of failure. Rachel walked past his table. She knew, in the microsecond before it happened, exactly what was about to occur. She saw his shoulders shift, saw the micro-calculation in his eyes, saw the moment he decided to tip his chair backward with surgical precision. The metal leg caught her ankle at the exact angle required for maximum impact. The tray went vertical, then horizontal, then scattered across the tile floor in a cascade of soup and sandwich and plastic dishes that clattered like a small explosion. The cafeteria went silent. Sound itself seemed to pause, as if the entire room had inhaled and was waiting to see what happened next. Sterling looked down at her from his seated position, his head tilted at an angle that suggested mild amusement at a small child's clumsiness. Around him, his colleagues froze in the suspended moment of people witnessing something they knew they shouldn't but couldn't quite look away from. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice soft enough to be conversational, hard enough to carry the weight of command. He leaned forward and gathered a stack of patient charts from the corner of his table. Before Rachel could respond, before her hands even moved toward the scattered food, he tossed the charts directly at her feet, papers cascading across the spilled soup, ink beginning to run where broth soaked into white paper. "And these need filing. Try to get something right today." Rachel stayed kneeling for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge the sharp warmth of humiliation that was supposed to break something inside her. She simply breathed. 1 breath in through her nose. 1 breath out. And then she moved, her hands methodical, her movements economical, gathering every scattered paper, every piece of food, every artifact of this small, calculated cruelty. Another tear escaped as she worked. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it fall, and she watched it darken the tile for a moment before she pressed it away with the back of her hand. Her movements were steady. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she spoke, came from somewhere deeper than emotion, older than the 2 years she'd been a civilian nurse, older than the 3 years since her son died. "I've cleaned up worse messes from better men," she said quietly. She stood and met Dr. Sterling's eyes without breaking contact, her gaze flat and direct and holding something he couldn't quite read, not anger, not resignation, not the wounded look he had been expecting. Just a clarity that suggested she had seen things that made his dismissal seem small. Insignificant. The kind of noise that happened in the background when larger forces were moving. She turned to leave. That's when she saw it. One chart had skidded farther than the others, sliding under a nearby table, the patient name facing upward. She retrieved it with careful hands, not hurrying, not rushing, as if the moment itself might break if she moved too quickly. Captain James Morrison. Room 212. Special Forces. Condition: Newt secondary to combat injury sustained in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Sanjin. The same valley where her son died. The same location listed on the letter that arrived at her door 3 years ago, delivered by a Navy chaplain in dress whites, her hand shaking as she opened it and read the words that explained how Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Torres, her son, her only child, the boy she had raised alone through deployments and redeployments, had been killed by an IED while conducting classified operations that the Pentagon would never fully explain. Captain James Morrison had signed that letter. Captain James Morrison had been her son's commanding officer. Rachel's hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change. But something inside her shifted like continental plates grinding against each other beneath the surface, creating earthquakes that no one standing above ground could see. She collected the last chart, straightened it, and walked away from Dr. Sterling's table, leaving him to his colleagues and his satisfied smirk and his belief that he had won something. The afternoon dissolved into the mechanical rhythm of vital signs and charting and the careful avoidance of anything that might require her to articulate what she had just discovered. Rachel moved through Oak Creek Memorial as if the hospital itself was a foreign country where she was fluent in the language but not yet ready to reveal it. At 2:14 p.m., during a routine medication pass, one of the nurses mentioned casually that Dr. Sterling had been making calls, 3 of them, to the temporary staffing agency that had placed Rachel here. The nurse whispered it like gossip, like warning, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of someone passing along information that wasn't technically hers to share. "He does this sometimes," she said, her eye sincere with the kind of sympathy that came from having watched the pattern repeat. "Get someone in his head, then makes enough calls about credential inconsistencies that the agency gets nervous. Board connections are a powerful thing. He's friends with people who have opinions about who stays and who doesn't." Rachel nodded once. Thanked her. Continued her work. But at 4:13 p.m., during the transition between day shift and evening shift, she found herself sitting in the break room, cup of coffee cooling in her hands, staring at her locker door. The metal grating revealed the boots inside, worn combat boots, desert tan, the leather creased from 1,000 kilometers of movement across terrain that no longer existed in any official records. Her son's boots. The only things they sent home besides the folded flag. The break room smelled like old coffee and the industrial residue of a dozen shifts ending, of people leaving their difficult days behind in this small fluorescent-lit space before returning to homes where they could pretend they'd never seen what they saw. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of electricity barely contained, the humming that most people stopped noticing after a few weeks. Rachel stared at those boots and understood, with the kind of clarity that came from having spent her entire adult life reading small signals and microscopic threats, that everything she had built, Rachel Torres, temporary nurse, nobody important, someone who existed on paper only, was about to collapse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of electricity barely contained, the humming that most people stopped noticing after a few weeks. Rachel stared at those boots and understood, with the kind of clarity that came from having spent her entire adult life reading small signals and microscopic threats, that everything she had built, Rachel Torres, temporary nurse, nobody important, someone who existed on paper only, was about to collapse. She was changing out Morrison's for line at 1:43 a.m. when the machines told her the truth. The cardiac monitor's rhythm looked wrong. Not immediately, not in a way that would send alarms screaming through the hospital. Just subtly wrong. A slight pressure change in the waveform. The way the ST segments looked slightly peaked. Her eyes narrowed. She'd seen this before. Not in a controlled American hospital with surgical lights and warming blankets. She'd seen it in a sandstorm outside Sanjin with mortar fire 8 kilometers out and a special forces medic screaming for help because their commanding officer's heart was being squeezed by something invisible. Tamponade. The cardiac monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then the rate climbed. 90. 105. 120. Morrison's eyes opened. His skin was already sheening with sweat, diaphoresis, the body's panic response to dying. His fingers clawed at the bedsheet with the desperation of someone whose oxygen wasn't reaching his brain fast enough. The jugular veins in his neck were distended like they'd been inflated, standing out against his pale skin like purple cords. Rachel moved before conscious thought caught up. She was already lifting his shirt, already assessing. The heart sounds were there but muffled, like listening to a bell underwater. Blood pressure dropping. 85 systolic. That wasn't a trend. That was a countdown. She hit the call button. Once. Twice. Then the intercom. Her voice came out level, conversational even, the way you spoke when you were describing something that would kill a man in the next 4 minutes if you let fear into your voice. Code cardiac. Room 212. Possible tamponade. Activate trauma protocol. The charge nurse, Patricia, arrived at 1:06 a.m. with the crash cart. Behind her came 2 residents moving like they were still learning how to run. No Dr. Sterling yet. That was fine. Rachel was already opening the ultrasound machine with one hand while the other started prepping Morrison's chest with chlorhexidine. The antiseptic smell rose up like a familiar ghost. What's the rhythm? Patricia was already reaching for the monitor pads. Pulsus paradoxus. Muffled heart sounds. See the JVD. Rachel pointed. Fluids compressing him. Patricia's face went through the quick calculation that trained nurses do without saying it aloud, symptoms matching, time window closing, attending physician not yet present. Do we call Sterling? He's called. Morrison's eyes found Rachel's. That was the thing about a mute patient, they could say everything with their eyes. His were screaming. She'd seen that look before. It was the same look Captain James Morrison had worn 3 years ago when the Navy chaplain told him about Sanjin. About what happened there. About the classified operation that officially never existed, the one she'd been ordered to forget, the one her son had died in. The same look she'd worn, probably, for approximately 2 seconds before she'd learned how to make her face into concrete. 144, Patricia said, watching the monitor. Pressures at 72. Rachel reached for the pericardiocentesis kit without hesitation. The 18-gauge needle was sterile, new, precisely the tool for what needed to happen. Her hands moved with a kind of certainty that didn't belong to a temporary nurse from a staffing agency. These were hands that had done this procedure in worse than a hospital room with proper lighting. These were hands that had done this in the dark, in a sandstorm, with a man bleeding out and incoming fire ripping through the compound's walls. Rachel. Patricia's voice had a question in it. Not accusation. Not yet. He's dying, Rachel said. She positioned the needle at the 5th intercostal space, just below the left nipple line. There was a moment, a breath, where the world narrowed to precisely what mattered, the anatomical landmarks, the pressure drop from 72 to 68, the sound of Morrison's breathing coming in gasps that sounded like prayers. She inserted the needle. The resistance was immediate. Then all the give. The needle found the pericardium like a key finding a lock. She advanced the catheter, withdrew the needle, and began aspirating. 50 cc of bloody fluid came out. 100. 150. The monitor changed. Pressure climbed to 80. To 90. To 98. Morrison's gasping breath steadied into something closer to normal. The jugular veins, those purple cords that had been strangling him with every heartbeat, started to deflate. 200 cc of pericardial fluid sat in the syringe. 200 cc of the reason a Navy SEAL had gone from dying to breathing. Rachel disposed of the needle in the sharps container with a soft clink. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should. Dr. Sterling arrived at 1:55 a.m. He came through the door still fastening his coat, his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd come from the call room instead of from home. His eye swept the room, the stabilized monitor, the disposed needle, the 4-line unchanged, Morrison breathing, and something dark moved across his face like a shadow crossing water. "Who authorized that procedure?" His voice was quiet. The quiet that comes right before a wound opens. Rachel turned. Their eyes met. She was holding the empty syringe. There was a small smear of Morrison's blood on her left glove. She didn't remove the glove or look away. "He was dying," she said. Sterling's jaw tightened. "You don't have physician privileges. You don't have authorization. You don't have the legal standing to aspirate a pericardium, and you sure as hell don't have the right to decide when protocol doesn't matter." His voice dropped to the kind of whisper that belonged in interrogation rooms. "Congratulations, Nurse Torres. You just performed a felony." Patricia was already opening the incident report form on the computer. The charge nurse's job was documentation. The charge nurse's job was always to document everything, because documentation was the only thing that mattered when lawsuits started flying and medical boards started asking questions. Sterling pointed at Rachel without looking at her. "I want a full incident report on my desk by 0600. I want her credentials flagged for independent audit. I want every medication she's touched in the last 72 hours cross-checked for proper authorization." Morrison tried to move. His right hand came up slowly, deliberately. He was trying to gesture, trying to speak with his eyes and his trembling fingers because speech wasn't available to him. The same thing that made him impossible to question was about to make him impossible to defend Rachel. Sterling ignored him completely. Rachel pulled off the contaminated glove and dropped it into the biohazard container. The movement was controlled. Precise. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She was thinking about a sandstorm. She was thinking about a 12-year-old boy in a photograph who'd never come home. She was thinking about combat boots sitting in a hospital locker like a time bomb with a ticking clock. She was thinking about the fact that Captain James Morrison, the man who'd sent the letter about her son, the man who'd carried the weight of command decisions that got people killed, was alive right now because she'd violated protocol. Because she'd made a choice that was technically illegal and medically correct and absolutely undeniable. Sterling's phone rang. He answered it before leaving the room, his voice already taking on the tone of someone calling in favors, asking allies to help him burn someone who'd made him look foolish for even a second. Rachel finished her documentation. The words were sterile, clinical, undeniable. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 1:53 a.m. 200 cubic centimeters pericardial fluid aspirated. Vital signs stabilized. Patient vitals, BP 98 60 seconds, HR 104, O2 sat 96%. All accurate. All factual. All damning. Morrison's eyes never left her face. She felt the weight of everything, the boots in her locker, the letter in her drawer, the classified operation that officially didn't happen, the son whose name she couldn't say out loud to anyone who'd ever accept the truth of it. She felt the weight of being a woman who couldn't exist in her own skin, who'd been ordered to forget a life, who'd been buried under new papers and a new identity and a story that didn't include her. And she felt something else. Something that moved through her like current through water. Something that looked, for just a moment, like recognition. Morrison raised his left hand higher. His fingers moved in a slow, deliberate pattern. Sign language. The kind they'd taught him in rehab because the Navy had taken his voice and he'd learned to make his hands speak instead. He was pointing at her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next, when his lips moved, just barely, just enough, and he whispered a single word. One word that shouldn't have been possible from a mute Special Forces officer who'd lost his voice 3 years ago in Sanjin, the same place where Rachel Torres had performed her first pericardiocentesis, the same place where everything had changed. By 7 in the morning, Dr. Sterling had already begun dismantling her. He sat at his desk in a corner office that smelled of expensive leather and burnt coffee, his fingers moving across the phone with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years cultivating the right kind of debt. 3 calls. That was all it took. The first went to Richard Bancroft, the board chairman, who answered on the second ring while Spanish guitar played softly in the background. Sterling's voice came out smooth as surgical glue. "Richard, I need to flag something. That temp nurse who performed an unsupervised pericardiocentesis last night, I'm concerned about her credentialing. Something about her competence level raises questions." Bancroft listened. Of course he listened. Bancroft had been listening to Sterling for 15 years, ever since Sterling had testified on his behalf in a malpractice deposition. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief medical officer, and the third to James Whitmore, the hospital's legal counsel. Same message, slightly reworded. Chain of command. Patient safety. Liability exposure. Credentials we should have verified. No accusations. No lies, technically. Just carefully shaped truth that fell into place like a house of cards designed to collapse under the weight of a single name. By 8:30, Rachel didn't know any of this yet. She was cleaning the breakfast dishes at home, her scrubs still damp from the overnight, her hands moving through the motions while her mind replayed the moment when Morrison's lips had formed that single word. Reaper. Her hands had slowed. The coffee mug hung suspended in the soapy water. The word belonged to someone else now, someone sealed behind classified documents and redacted files, someone the Pentagon had buried deeper than any grave. At 9:15, the hospital administrator, Victoria Huang, made her decision under pressure she didn't fully understand. The board members had texted her before she'd even finished her first coffee. Questions. Concerns. The word liability. She scheduled a meeting with Sterling for 9:45, and by 10, she'd made the call to the temporary staffing agency. Not a complaint. Not an accusation. A precautionary administrative review. The agency's manager promised swift action. By 10:30, the paperwork was already moving. An inquiry. A flag on Rachel's profile. Questions about prior military training that didn't appear on her resume. At 10:43, Sterling walked into the morning staff meeting like a man who had just secured an advantage. Rachel was already there, still in her scrubs from the night shift, standing beside the medication cart. She didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at him since the cafeteria, since her food had scattered across that floor like the evidence of her own insignificance. The charge nurse, Margaret, tried to speak first. "Dr. Sterling, about last night, Rachel saved Captain Morrison's life." The procedure was textbook. Sterling raised one hand, cutting her off with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. "This isn't about outcomes, Margaret. This is about protocol. About a chain of command that keeps our patients safe." His eyes found Rachel's across the room. "If we allow temporary staff to perform invasive procedures without authorization, we invite chaos. We invite liability. We invite disaster." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the only muscle that moved. "We have standards for a reason," Sterling continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "Those standards exist to protect people. I'm sure this nurse," he still hadn't said her name, "had the best intentions. But intentions don't replace credentials." By 11 o'clock, Rachel's badge had been flagged in the system. By 11:30, the hospital's legal team had sent Sterling a formal document requesting an independent review of her credentials and her actions during the cardiac emergency. The language was careful and institutional. Regarding the unauthorized performance of an invasive procedure. Credentialing discrepancies. Potential liability exposure requiring investigation. The words appeared on Victoria Huang's desk, and she signed off on the investigation request with a pen that trembled slightly in her hand, not from doubt, but from the weight of protecting her hospital from the lawsuit that might come if she didn't. By noon, the decision had been made. The security officers arrived at Rachel's station at 11:58. Two of them, both large men with radios clipped to their belts and the apologetic expressions of people enforcing policy they'd been instructed not to question. "Rachel Torres," one of them said, and she turned, already knowing what came next because she'd spent 12 years recognizing when authority was about to be removed from her hands. We need you to come with us. The walk through the hospital corridors felt like moving through water. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating a high-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Nurses turned to watch. An orderly dropped a bedpan, the clatter hitting the tile like punctuation to an ending. No one spoke. The elevator descended. The lobby doors opened. Outside, the January air bit at her throat, cold and thin and nothing like the desert. The guard held out his hand. I'm going to need your badge. She unpinned it from her scrubs, still warm from her body, and placed it in his palm. He ran it through the deactivation reader. The electronic beep was final, a small sound that somehow contained the entire weight of dismissal. Dr. Sterling watched from his third-floor office window as Rachel walked across the parking lot. His arms were crossed, his expression the satisfied mask of someone who had just removed a problem with surgical precision. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had already moved on to the next task, the next call, the next carefully worded email. By the time Rachel's car had disappeared around the corner, Sterling had already drafted a message to the temp agency requesting a formal background investigation. Suspicious proficiency with invasive procedures. Undisclosed prior training. Competence level that raises credentialing questions. The words fell into place like he'd written them 1,000 times before. For him, they probably had. For Sterling, destruction was routine. For Rachel, it was something else entirely. She made it home in silence, her hand steady on the wheel at the stoplights, her breathing controlled. Muscle memory took over, the same muscle memory that had carried her through 2 melting temperatures in San Jin, through 3 tours where steady hands meant the difference between someone's son coming home and someone's son coming home in a flag-draped box. She climbed the stairs to her house slowly, one hand trailing against the wall. By the time she reached the kitchen, her composure had begun to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a bone breaking from the inside out. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs that still smelled like the hospital, like antiseptic and blood and the particular loneliness of being removed from the place where you belonged. Her hands were on the table in front of her. She didn't recognize them for a moment. They looked like someone else's hands, someone who'd been fired at noon, someone who'd failed to protect even the simplest secret. The tears came without warning. Not silent tears. Not composed tears. The kind of tears that came from deeper than muscle, deeper than bone, from the place where she'd been storing the news of her son's death for 3 years, the place where the Navy chaplain's words had landed like shrapnel. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in gasps she couldn't control. She didn't try to stop it. She just sat there at the kitchen table, still wearing the scrubs that no longer belonged to her, crying in a way she hadn't since that day when the world had ended and kept spinning anyway. That's where Maya found her at 2 o'clock. Rachel's daughter was 17, tall like her father had been, with eyes that missed nothing and hands that had learned to hold things carefully after learning what it meant to lose them. She was wearing Michael's dog tags around her neck, had been wearing them every day for 3 years, the small metal rectangles a weight she'd chosen over the lighter grief of forgetting. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, the brightness of her afternoon draining away when she saw her mother. "Mom? Why are you home?" The question was simple. The answer was impossible. Rachel lifted her eyes, and for a moment, she couldn't find words that wouldn't betray everything. Couldn't find language that would explain the classified life, the missions that officially never happened, the woman she'd been ordered to stop being. The silence stretched like a bridge no words could cross. "They said I don't belong there," she finally whispered. Maya set down her backpack slowly. She crossed the kitchen and sat beside her mother, and without being asked, she took Rachel's hand. Her fingers were warm. Real. Present in a way that held Rachel to the moment rather than letting her drift into the past. "That's what they said about Michael in boot camp," Maya said quietly, her voice steady in a way that made her sound older than 17. "And he proved them wrong." Rachel closed her eyes, and more tears came, because Michael had proved them so completely wrong, had earned his spot and his rank and his respect through 12 years of service that ended in a valley where the rocks were the color of old bone. The only person who'd been there that day, who'd witnessed what she'd done, was lying in room 212 with a functioning heart and no voice to defend her name. 5 days of silence. That was how long Rachel had been sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the phone on the counter, waiting for it to ring or waiting for the courage to smash it. Her daughter Maya had stopped asking when she'd get her job back. The question had died somewhere between the first night of crying and the morning Rachel couldn't get out of bed. The laundry pile in the hallway had grown into a geography of her collapse: scrubs from Monday, street clothes from Tuesday, a hoodie she'd pulled on Wednesday and hadn't taken off since. The phone rang at 9:48 a.m. on Friday. Rachel didn't move. It rang again. Third ring, she reached for it like it might bite. Ms. Torres. A woman's voice, professional, careful. This is Linda Chen from Oak Creek Memorial's legal department. We'd like to request your presence at a board meeting. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. It's regarding your termination. Rachel's throat closed. She managed, I don't think I have anything left to say. We believe you do. A pause. Captain Morrison has requested your attendance. Personally. The hospital lobby smelled like floor wax and dying flowers in a corner arrangement nobody was tending. Rachel stood just inside the main entrance for 3 full minutes, watching staff move past her in scrubs she'd never wear again, her hands cold enough that she kept them pressed against her legs. She wore civilian clothes, black slacks, a grey blazer, trying to look like a person who belonged in a boardroom instead of a person who'd been escorted out by security. Her daughter had called her that morning. You're going to destroy them, Mom. Maya didn't understand that destruction required energy, and Rachel was hollow. The boardroom was on the 4th floor. Mahogany table. 7 board members in chairs that cost more than Rachel's first car. And there, near the window where morning light made his wheelchair seem like a throne, sat Captain Morrison. He hadn't turned to look at her yet. His body language was rigid, military precise even in paralysis. The ventilator beside him wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, a sound Rachel had learned to read like vital signs. But his eyes. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were the color of the sky over Sanjin before the firefight, and they were tracking her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. She sat down. Nobody told her to. Morrison's right hand began to move. It took him 3 seconds to lift it, neurological recovery slower than his will. He pointed at Rachel. Then his fingers formed a shape, a letter, another letter, spelling something in American Sign Language. The sign they taught him in rehab. The sign that meant command. Authority. The sign that meant someone who gave orders and people obeyed. Then he whispered. His voice came like a transmission through static, broken, unforced and absolutely clear, Reaper. The room didn't just go quiet. The room forgot how to make sound. Rachel's hands were in her lap and they were shaking now, not from fear but from recognition, he knew. He'd known since 1:16 a.m. when her hands had moved on muscle memory that no temporary civilian nurse should possess. The name hung in the air between them like a physical object. Reaper. Call sign. Operational designation. The woman she wasn't supposed to be anymore. The door opened. Rachel's daughter stepped forward. She was holding a folder. Maya looked at her mother for 1 second, then turned to the board, and in that voice that came from the Torres bloodline, steady, unflinching, military-bred, she said, "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres." The room seemed to tilt. A Navy nurse in dress whites, actually Navy, full dress uniform, ribbon spanning her chest, stepped forward with a classified file. Rachel knew the color. She knew that seal. The nurse opened the folder and began to read, and each citation was like a weight dropping into the center of the table. Silver star for Valor. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. Commendation for service in Sanjin, 2009. The nurse paused. Service in Baghdad, 2011. Another pause. And 3 additional operations in locations that remain redacted per Department of Defense classification guidelines. The board members were looking at each other like they'd walked into a classified briefing by accident. Then the door opened again. A man in civilian clothes, mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years making decisions that got people killed. A SEAL team leader. Rachel hadn't seen Lieutenant Commander Graves in 5 years. She hadn't expected to see him again in this lifetime. He looked at her and his eyes went wet immediately, but his voice was level. Senior Chief Torres saved 12 lives in Sanjin Valley on the date in question. She saved mine. She saved Captain Morrison's. Then the Pentagon buried the entire operation and ordered her into witness protection after she exposed war crimes during the post-action investigation. Graves moved closer to the board. She's been classified as inactive since that operation. Her records were sealed. Her service erased from every official database. She was paid a severance in 2009 and ordered to construct a civilian identity and never acknowledge what she'd done. The room was so silent you could hear Morrison's ventilator. Then an FBI agent who'd been sitting in the back corner, Rachel hadn't even noticed him until he walked forward with a tablet. Dr. Jonathan Sterling attempted to delete hospital security footage from this facility on the night of June 9th. He used administrative override codes to access the server room at 2:14 a.m. What he didn't know was that Jake Martinez, the IT specialist in your technology department and a Marine veteran, was monitoring real-time access logs. Mr. Martinez made encrypted backups of every frame Sterling attempted to delete. The agent turned the tablet toward the board. This footage documents 8 years of systematically abusive behavior. 3 previous nurses who left the hospital under duress. 2 formal complaints that were buried. 1 junior resident who attempted suicide after 6 weeks of documented humiliation by Dr. Sterling. The agent walked toward the head of the table. We have emails from Dr. Sterling to the staffing agency containing false allegations about Ms. Torres' credentials, sent within hours of her emergency response. We have cafeteria camera footage of him deliberately pushing her food tray to the floor. We have audio recordings from the nurse's station of him making a public bet regarding her employment termination. He set a folder on the table. We have his own voice describing her as unqualified, dangerous, and not appropriate for clinical medicine. The board chair looked like he was about to have his own cardiac arrest. Dr. Sterling's behavior, the FBI agent continued, became a federal matter when he attempted to obstruct justice by destroying evidence. Additionally, 3 of the board members present in this room have accepted social invitations and golf outings sponsored by Dr. Sterling during the previous disciplinary cases. That creates liability questions for Oak Creek Memorial that are no longer administrative. That becomes statutory. The chair stood. Then sat back down. Then stood again, like his body couldn't decide what to do with the information that he'd been complicit in enabling a predator for nearly a decade. Dr. Sterling is placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of this federal investigation, the chair said, his voice small. His privileges are suspended indefinitely. We will be cooperating fully with federal authorities and recommending his termination for cause. He looked at Rachel. The board apologizes for allowing this situation to escalate to this severity. We failed in our duty to protect our staff. Rachel didn't respond. She was looking at Morrison. He was looking back at her with tears streaming down his face, his hand still raised, still pointing at her like she was a coordinate on a map and he'd finally found her. The Navy nurse moved forward and placed something on the table in front of Rachel. A name badge. Not temporary. Permanent. It read, Rachel Torres, RN, BSN, Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired. The retired was technically a lie. She remained classified, remained technically in service, but the Navy had authorized the recognition after Morrison's statement to federal investigators detailing exactly who had saved his life at 1:51 a.m. The board chair offered Rachel a position, emergency department educator. Full-time. Tenure track. Her real rank, her real credentials, her real name. She said yes. Monday morning, Rachel clocked in with a real badge. The staff applauded when she entered the emergency department. Actually applauded, like she was a visiting dignitary, like they'd known all along that the quiet temporary nurse had been something else entirely. The charge nurse handed her a folder containing job descriptions and orientation materials, then leaned close and whispered, "We knew. We just didn't know how we knew." That afternoon, Rachel visited room 212 one last time before Morrison's discharge. He was sitting up now, his voice stronger, scratchy like gravel underfoot but actual voice. His eyes found her and he smiled, a real smile, lopsided from the stroke but genuine. "Your son," he whispered. "Michael. Sanjin. June 2009. He paused, breathing through the effort. He held the line so we could extract. "Didn't suffer. Instant." Another pause. "He talked about you. Every day. Said his mom was the toughest person in the service." Rachel's vision blurred. She reached for his hand and held it. "He was right," Morrison whispered. She held his hand for 5 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "He's in the memorial case now. His boots. I'm putting them there tomorrow. With your Purple Heart. Both of you. Same ground. Same day." Morrison nodded. His ventilator hissed. The hospital's main lobby had a memorial case that nobody paid attention to, a few thank you plaques from grateful families, some outdated charity photos. Rachel placed Michael's combat boots in that case the next morning, arranged them carefully beside Captain Morrison's Purple Heart. Her daughter stood beside her, reading the plaque Rachel had written the night before, in memory of hospitalman Michael Torres and all who served. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." The hospital held a small ceremony that afternoon. Morrison came in his wheelchair. Jake Martinez was there, quietly receiving a hospital commendation from the board for his integrity. 3 nurses who'd suffered under Sterling's regime stood together, and for the first time in years, they looked like they could breathe. The administrator asked if Rachel wanted to speak. She looked at those boots in the glass case, at her daughter beside her, at Morrison's quiet nod of support. Then she turned to the assembled staff and said, "I'm not hiding anymore." The camera would have held on those boots in the memorial case, light catching the worn leather, the dust from 2 different wars, the reflection of Rachel beyond the glass in the emergency department behind, teaching a resident about pericardiocentesis, her hands moving with absolute certainty, her voice calm and clear, finally, undeniably belonging. If you're watching this, you already know the power of showing up. You already understand that hidden strength is still strength. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment. What's one thing you've been ordered not to talk about? When did someone finally see who you really were? Let's talk about it in the comments below.